Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast connecting the past to the present and improving historical and political literacy. I'm your host, Colin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jay. And this week, we're going to continue our mini-series on the fall of the French Third Republic in our larger series of the fall of empires. So, Jay, why don't you pick up where we left off last week?
Thanks, Colin. Yes, we are continuing our fall of the French Third Republic series. Just want to give a couple shout outs. I want to give a shout out to our new subscribers on YouTube: Joseph Cano, Roderick Van Hees, Stan Williams, and Harahan Ravichandran. Sorry, Harahan, jacked your name up there. But anyway, thanks for subscribing to us on YouTube. And just a reminder for any of our new subscribers, or if you leave us a 5-star review and a comment so we can see your name on any platform that you listen to this podcast, we'll try to give you a shout out in our next episode. All right, with that, we are back to our next episode on the fall of France. And today we're going to start off talking about the Dreyfus Affair. And Colin, I don't know about you, but I remember hearing about the Dreyfus Affair when I was in high school, but I didn't really understand the depth and the significance that it had on France.
It was like one of those things that you get 5 minutes of a lesson on. That, that's it. It's kind of like it's just brought up.
Yeah, you're told that it happened, but you don't really know what happened.
It happened in this year, and this is who was on trial. This is why. This is what he's accused of. This is the outcome. Okay, moving on. It was obviously significant enough to be brought up, but not significant enough that we, as at least in American high schools, because it was in high school when I heard it, really studied it in depth. And honestly, from that point on, really up until we started bringing this up again, did I revisit the Dreyfus Affair.
Right. Yeah. I kind of said this last week, but it's fascinating. I had no idea. And the parallels to what's going on in, 2024 United States and our political dissension is incredible. It really is. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So
what kind of things can you dive into that, and so we can explore for our listeners what some of the similar just to tee you up right there.
Yeah, thank you. That was a softball. Yeah, real quick, I want to just introduce the Dreyfus Affair, and then so I mentioned last week, but if you weren't able to hear our episode last week, this week I'll say it again. My overwhelmingly main source for this series is William Scher's The Collapse of the Third Republic. Fantastic book. William Scher is a little more well-known for his book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He was an American journalist. He was there at the time. A lot of this is his firsthand accounts, but being a journalist, he also did a lot of research. So we'll do a quick what was the Dreyfus Affair, and then I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from Scher here. So in 1894, a gentleman named Captain Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason by a military court-martial and sentenced with a dishonorable discharge, military degradation, and a life imprisonment in a place called Devil's Island, which is off the coast of French Guiana in South America. Military degradation is the public humiliation of a military officer, where they get their rank stripped off them, they get their sword taken away, they usually have to parade or march down a row of troops who turn their back on them. It's essentially a humiliation ceremony. So after he was dishonorably discharged, had this humiliation ceremony, he had a wife and kids, I believe. He was shipped off to this island on the other side of the Atlantic. And Devil's Island is exactly what it sounds like. It was tropical. It was super hot. And as he spent his first several years there, it was killing him. His health went way down. Malaria was really bad, that kind of thing. Remember in 1894, there were not very many medicines for this kind of stuff. To briefly summarize what happened, Dreyfus ended up being completely innocent for military treason. And as it came out, this decades-long affair is what the French would call it, it became clear that he was convicted entirely because he was Jewish. And remember, this affair went on into the 19 teens and 20s, uh, and there were multiple courts. It was a wild drama in France, and he ended up being innocent, but yet he was he was convicted because he was Jewish. So reading from Schur here to kind of get why we're bringing this up here in this podcast and what to help us understand how the Dreyfus Affair tore apart France and prepared the way for the Nazi invasion in 1940. So this is Schur. For the next 12 years, France would be torn by strife over the rights and wrongs of this case that at times bordered on bitter, if bloodless, civil war. Families were torn asunder, old friendships destroyed, duels fought, governments overthrown, careers ruined. Some men went to prison, some committed suicide. There were riots in the streets, and mobs threatened the lives of leaders courageous enough to express doubts of the guilt of the condemned Jew. The president of the republic was spat upon and caned. The whole country seemed to be consumed by blind hatred and intolerance. It was hopelessly and hysterically divided between those, mainly on the right, who believed Dreyfus guilty, and those, mainly on the left, who over the years became convicted that he was innocent. The victim of a vicious miscarriage of justice engineered by the reactionary, anti-Semitic Army Officer Corps and maintained by it even after the High Court of Appeals had exposed the purged and forged evidence. Long after the end of the affair, as the French called it, the question of the guilt of Dreyfus became almost lost in the melee, giving way to a fundamental conflict over the very moral concepts of French society, which cast its shadow over the Third Republic from then on to the end. For to the army leaders and their backers in the church, and among the conservative classes, the supreme issue became not whether Dreyfus was guilty, though they believed he was, but even if he was innocent, it were better that he suffered the tortures of the damned, as he was literally doing on Devil's Island, than that the prestige and the honor of the French army, on which the defense of the country depended, be impugned. Of what significance was the life and honor of one individual compared to the life and honor of the country? Of what significance were naked truth and naked justice for the individual, and even respect for the human personality, regardless of race or religion, if adhering to them undermine the confidence of the people in the leaders of the army and sap their faith in the constituted authorities and thus weaken the fiber of the nation? Above everything else lay the national interest, and throughout history, individuals had been sacrificed for it, as had truth and justice.
This is a long quote, but that was a very good one. It's interesting, like, as you hear about the Dreyfus Affair, you listen to that quote, how the left kind of viewed him as a martyr and how it spurned on a lot of, I guess, political action because of this. Or wouldn't you say so?
Yeah.
He became a true martyr for them. They used a lot of the key words, like there was a miscarriage of justice, essentially, is what, I mean, that was 2 paragraphs of what they were characterizing, and that people would lose faith in the current regime. They kind of sowed some of those seeds, like, because of this, there's no faith in the current, kind of like when we had the fall of the Han dynasty, and we talked about the fall of the Qing during some of those, they lost the mandate of heaven. It's kind of similar. Like, you've lost the faith of the people, those that you are ruling over. And now he's this martyr. So it's kind of like a spark for political action, political revolution, really.
Yeah. And just a little bit more context on what happened. Essentially, their French counterintelligence had identified a spy in the 1890s. They'd identified a spy, and they found out, because they were getting snippets of his German handler. They found out that his last name began with a D. And instead of going, maybe his German handler isn't using his real last name in correspondence, they just went, who are all the people that have access to this information with the last name of D? And Dreyfus was the only guy. So they were like, guilty. And that's no kidding. Like the extremely flimsy evidence, there's like one thing. Well, then later, so they did the court martial, they convicted him, and everyone was like, this Jew, traitor, convicted him. Well, like years, like 3 years, I think, after the fact, there was one guy still in the counterintelligence organization in the French army who was like, for whatever reason, came back up. And they looked at the case and they were like, wait a minute. Oh, that's what it was. They were relooking at the handwriting that they claimed to have belonged to Dreyfus. And they looked at it, and some random guy was like, that's not Dreyfus's handwriting. That's this other guy's handwriting. And they compared it, and it looked the exact same for this complete other guy. I forget his name. And that initiated the entire Dreyfus Affair. And this dude, the dude who's in the counterintelligence organization that kind of called the BS flag, was like, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. He was later put in prison because when he started like voicing this up the chain, the senior leaders in the army were like, shut up. Nobody wants to hear about this anymore. And he was like, my conscience will not allow me to shut up. I'm going to like leak this to the press. And he's like, well, you're going to jail.
Yeah, it was
So
like
they put him in.
his name was like Major du. Hold on, let me make sure I pronounce this correctly. Let me work on Major du Pâté de Clam.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one that raised the flag. Like, I don't think this is it.
Yeah. And there was like a very small cadre of individuals that became convinced that Dreyfus was wrongfully convicted. And that's why when Schur is talking about like, the army had invested so much capital in publicly humiliating this guy, and especially pressing on the note that he was Jewish. And that the Jews were in cahoots with the Germans, like similar conspiracy theories. We've talked about this before in like our Russia-Ukraine podcast, that like the Jews just constantly get blamed for a lot of conspiracy theories.
Excuse me. It was Gabriel Hanatal who had raised the alarm that it was a forgery. Declam was the one that initially investigated and found some. It doesn't really make sense.
Stuff,
and then Hanatal, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, was the one that said, "No, this isn't it."
But kind of getting
my names.
No, you're good. The kind of getting back to your original point, Colin. It's like I think one of the tragedies of the whole Dreyfus affair is that like the conservatives and the army in particular, like they were trying to do a good thing, preserve the prestige and honor of the country, preserve the honor of the officer corps, right? They understood that it needed to maintain credibility because it had the task of defending the nation. And if there's cracks in the armor of the officer corps, like literally weakens the defense of the country.
And
you're
this
gonna have a hard
is
time.
20 years. This is 20 years after they were humiliated in the Franco-Prussian War. Like, I don't think, like, it's hard for Americans to conceptualize taking a loss that badly, but like the Franco-Prussian War, the French, who were the strongest in the world, got smoked by this kind of upstart, kingdom of Prussia that then became what we consider modern Germany. Just wiped the floor with them, and they had to sign these humiliating, and we talked about it last week, these humiliating agreements. We're 20 years past that. And it's interesting that you said, well, you brought up, he was Jewish, and it seems like a lot of Jews seem to kind of constantly fall into blame. It's interesting, like a lot of these kind of conservatives in the military wanted to protect the integrity of the army. I personally don't think that Dreyfus was blamed because he was Jewish. However, I do think that under pressure, that the prosecution, those that were coming after him and investigate him, saw an opportunity to say, okay, it starts with the letter D, Dreyfus. Dreyfus is Jewish. Let's put it on him. And like, this is our way that we can put it on somebody, and we can become the good guys, and we can rile up a lot of potential prejudices that exist, and then push it on somebody. We can come out the heroes, and we're doing our job. We found a culprit. And, it would be a lot harder to blame somebody who is like a Bonaparte or somebody like that, or a national hero. It's very hard to do, a true Frenchman, but he's Jewish. We can put
Yeah.
it on him. We can blame him. They thought it was an easy win.
Yes. No, you're right. The initial like investigation, it was just his last name. But the vehemency that the affair took on was because of his ethnicity. And it was one of those things that like, when the army had made that decision in the court martial, they didn't want to go back. Like they didn't want to apologize because there was so much angst in the fact so that he was Jewish. There were members of the Chamber of Deputies when this later became like a very large political concern. There were uh, representatives in the Chamber of Deputies who were screaming death to Jews, like, and trying to drown out the political movements to like reopen the case and take it back to the court. Like these guys were screaming death to Jews. Like it's a pretty like anti-Semitism was alive and well in a way that is kind of hard to fathom now, even though it's still alive and well today. But still, like, I don't know if we would hear that kind of stuff. One note on the Army Officer Corps, like I think, and this is one of the things that kind of shows its relevancy to here in the United States, like a lie is a lie. And when you try to maintain credibility by doubling down on a lie, you are setting yourself up for trouble. Despite how, the best of intentions that you may have, you're fundamentally defending a lie, and that's never going to work out well for you. What we saw here in the Army Officer Corps is that they, at the end of the day, like they lost a ton of credibility. And it absolutely affected how the public supported the institution. Kind of similar in, like in World War I, there was a lot of backlash in Great Britain against Haig and a lot of the generals because they saw them as fools, right? And what that led to was big time budget cuts for the British Army after World War I, so that when World War II shows up, there's like barely an army. There was no, like, the British Expeditionary Force was a hollow shell in World War II of what it was compared to World War One. So that's just one example of like, losing credibility in the army is kind of like, yeah, whatever. I think sometimes it's easy for Americans to forget or not realize how well we've done in the United States of insulating our military from like a lot of political disputes.
Yeah.
That's normally not the case.
Well, yeah. I mean, just case in point, when was the last time that you heard like the defense budget get seriously slashed? At a minimum, it stays the same or it goes up. That's
Obama
pretty much
in
it.
2012.
1 year. So 1 year,
Sequestration.
exactly. 1 year during the sequestration, and then it was quickly reversed because we're like, this isn't good. 1 year.
I don't think it was reversed.
No, not reversed, but I'm saying the budget, did the budget increase the following year and then every subsequent year?
I don't think so. I don't think it. Yeah, double check. I think sequestration like was a gut punch, and it didn't go up until Trump came in office. Or if it did go up, it was like not meaningful. But I could be wrong.
Okay. No, you are right. So, but here's the fall. So in 2011, I guess this was to 2012, we were at 752. We went down all the way to 2015, and then we started going up. And since we had a few years in the 90s where we kind of like leveled out as a whole, but by 1999, we were spending again. 2000, we were spending again. My point in saying that is we didn't half the government budget. The budget dropped those years that you mentioned.
Was it like a 10% cut?
We went from $752 billion to $725 billion. We went all the way down in 2015 to 633. So yeah, about a 15 to 15% budget cut. But then we went right back up. And I remember, that was a kind of a tough time in the military.
Oh, it was a very tough time in the military.
So I'm looking at the graph, and it's like it's going up, 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 up. It kind of flat, up, 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 dips down a little bit, and then it goes right back up.
Yeah.
And we stopped spending $70 billion. We were still spending over 600. My point in all of that is saying the United States is extremely insulated
Yeah.
the
Our
military is.
military. Yeah.
We are always fighting somewhere overseas. Barack Obama still dropped 20 something thousand bombs overseas.
Right.
Wars were still happening.
Yeah.
Every president had them. Or
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Our military is, post Vietnam has been kind of insulated from a lot of the political fighting, but nevertheless, like, you know, Vietnam is a case in point in which the credibility of the military was very much put in doubt. Like, obviously, the military didn't choose itself to go over there into Vietnam. Like, we've always had civilian control of the military. Yes, the military was influential. There's H.R. McMaster's Dereliction of Duty is a great book. But nevertheless, like in this instance, this was, the Dreyfus Affair was a military court martial. It was a military decision, and it did irreparable damage to the institution of the military. So that when, World War One happened, World War Two happened, like the French military was just not what it had been really over the last 1,000 years. One last point that I wanted to make before we move on, and that is like, and I started making it earlier, but I want to sit on it for a second. And that is, I'm sure the military at that time thought they were doing the right thing. Like they thought they were like, it is very important that we preserve the credibility of the military. It's not about whether or not Dreyfus is guilty or not. It's about maintaining our honor. I think to open up a totally different can of worms, but I think it's relevant here, and that's election security here in the United States now, right? Like you've got folks on the left, who actually, no, it applies to both parties. If, let's rewind to when Trump won the election in 2016, right? What was so many Democrats and Hillary Clinton screaming at the top of their lungs? Russian interference, right? Like, hey, we want every American to doubt the legitimacy of this election. And I remember thinking at that time, I was like, oh, it's not good. Not a good call. Like, shouldn't be doing that. And then conversely, in 2020, Joe Biden beats Donald Trump. And what's a lot of people on the right doing? He stole it. Election interference. Like, there's stuff in the ballots, blah, blah, blah. And the problem is there's actually a little bit of evidence to support each view. Like, were the Russians, quote unquote, interfering in the 2016 election? They absolutely were. There's plenty of, open source stuff out there to see that, like, there were Russian entities that were trying to do, influential things to affect the outcome of the election. Did it have any significant role in winning Donald Trump the election? I don't believe so. Going back, fast forward to 2020 with election, fraud or things like that. Did election fraud occur? It absolutely did. Were there instances of people breaking the law in various states? Yes, there absolutely were. Was it significant enough to change the election in one direction or not? No. And I actually think William Barr put that really well. It's like, yes, there were election irregularities, but they were not significant enough to change the result of the election. So the point I'm trying to make here is I personally believe that, like, when I hear that these officers were like, it's not about whether or not it was right. It's about defending the institution of the thing. In my mind, like, emotionally speaking, I feel compelled to defend the institution of, representative democracy in our elections from both. Like, I think it's been attacked on the last two general election cycles from both the left and the right. But we can't make the same mistake in defending the institution that the French did in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that is completely disregard truth. I think we need to do our due diligence regardless of who favors at that time, but we have to do our due diligence to go, okay, what happened? What are the results? And then we need to do right by, punishing people who broke the law, retaliating and or, doing whatever for the Russians, you name it. Institutions need to be protected, but they don't have to be protected by defending a lie.
So, Jay, I don't mean to caveat that into like back into the French Republic, but
Mm.
because yes, the pursuit of truth should always be first and foremost. How did this event in the Dreyfus Affair spurn the collapse of the French Third Republic? It's a question I've been waiting to ask, but it's an interesting one. And like I understand that this happened decades before
Yeah.
the technical collapse. However, the government, the republic, was never fully. It was never fully. I don't know how to say this properly, but it never seemed like it had a shot at lasting longer than a century. It
Mm.
never seemed like it could stand the test of the two world wars, partly because, as we mentioned last week, it started off with kind of weak leadership and sort of a mixed feelings of why we even want to have a republic in the first place. Do we want a king? Do we want traditionalists? Do we want to be this kind of new republic?
Yeah.
And it was kind of the lowest form of compromise that amongst all parties that they could get. So with this event, how did this seminal event in French history, especially the Third
Yeah.
Republic, kind of push the dominoes, if you will?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Yeah. It further divided the country in like an extremely severe way. Because did it weaken the institution of the officer corps? Yes. But in that first paragraph that I was reading from Sure, like it was basically a bloodless civil war. And you had people on the right who were utterly convinced that he was guilty. And you had people on the left who, like you said, were utterly convinced that he was a martyr being murdered at the hands of the fanatical right. And it created this like long-term angst that really lasted a long time. I mean, the affair itself Sure says it lasted 12 years, but there were people on into the 20s that would still say that Dreyfus was guilty. And when you have that political divide in your country, the glue that keeps your country together is not sufficient. Like it's just all it needs is one good hammer stroke and the whole thing comes crashing down.
It's kind of interesting because if you compare this to a somewhat similar case in Great Britain or the British Empire, really, I don't know if many of you have ever seen the movie Breaker Morant, but that was actually a historical, it was based on a true story. Right around the same time, there was a British officer. I think he was Australian or was British and he moved to Australia. And this just kind of jogged my memory. So details are a little fuzzy. But during the Boer War, so 1902, I think it was, he was fighting the Boers and he was accused of war crimes and he was accused of killing Boer prisoners. And he was eventually found guilty and executed. And it caused quite a stir because the Boer War was a very contentious one. It was pretty bloody.
Yeah.
It was not, didn't always go well for the British. So, and it kind of came out. There's some why he did it. They think that he shot him out of revenge. When there were some other theories that he didn't actually kill him, and they weren't really, there's conflicting reports out there. Regardless, he was convicted and he was executed 18 hours after his court martial.
Oh, wow.
This didn't. It's one of those events that didn't sink the British Empire at all. Whereas the Dreyfus Affair, similarly happened in the military. It happened at a time where we need to show strength because like the French had just lost to the Prussians, now the Germans. The British were not doing great against the Boers in South Africa. So two similar events that could have had very similar long-lasting effects did not. I mean, the British Empire went away, but that was for other reasons. It didn't cause the same kind of political divide that would eventually lead to the breakup of a country.
Yeah, but to your point, like it doesn't always have to be super drastic, right? And I think one of the reasons like that we're going through this series on the fall of empires, I don't think you or I believe the United States is on imminent collapse. I mean, there's no reason to believe that, in 100 years, the United States is going to fall apart. But as we talked about the Roman Empire, as we talked about the Byzantine empires, especially, like once that inertia gets going, it's really hard to stop. And I think like that's what happened in both of the Eastern and Western Roman empires. Like it was just death by a thousand cuts, and you had a little thing and one more little thing and one more little thing. And if you don't stop it and if you don't do something about it, it will kill you eventually.
It's funny you say that because I know our non-American listeners are going to hate that I say this, but if the U.S. goes under very imminently, has an imminent collapse, then the whole world is really screwed. It's kind of like
Oh, yeah, for
the
sure.
Rich Dad Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki. When they were asking him because he's in like $1 billion worth of debt, and he goes, if I can't pay my debts, the bank's screwed, not me. It's like if the U.S. was to suddenly like collapse, like the world there would be some serious problems. And I know a lot of people kind of hold their
Oh,
noses
yeah.
up to the US, but I mean, the reality is like the worldwide economy would absolutely collapse. So would so many other things. So, yeah, let's hope for all our sake that it doesn't happen imminently.
Yeah. That's a plus because one of the things that we've talked about in a few episodes is when few people want your society to survive, you are including the people who are within that society, as in the case of the Han or in the Byzantines. Obviously, your society is at risk for going away. But to your point, Colin, I think that's something hopeful. When we talk about the United States, is like globally speaking, there's a lot of people who are incentivized to ensure that the United States remains the status quo, if not like the number one power, but still a stable country for sure.
So what happened after the Dreyfus Affair?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about, since we're still talking about the military, let's talk about World War One. Okay. So the goal of this episode or of this series is to talk about the things that contributed to the fall of France in 1940. And I'm very much following Schur here. His subtitle of his book is An Inquiry into the Fall of France in 1940. And I'm going to follow Schur here because he doesn't really go into much detail about what happened in World War One. But rather, we're going to spend some time talking about the lessons that the French learned from World War One that had a extremely negative effect on their military and how they prepared for World War Two, which hopefully our next episode will be caught up to World War Two, and we'll talk about, or rather, we'll get caught up to 1936, and we'll talk about the remilitarization of the Rhineland and kind of the state of French affairs at that time. So, but just as a broad overview, as World War One began in August of 1914, all of Europe kind of felt like it was coming for quite some time. And when it started, everyone talks about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria Hungary, and how the Russians were very bellicose. And when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and Russia was declared war on Austria-Hungary, and then Germany declared war on Russia, and then France, had to come to the defense of Russia, but then everyone thought that they were going to go through Belgium, so they got the Brits involved. And like everyone, and again, I've talked about Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August book so many times, but she does a really good job talking about like everyone kind of wanted World War One in the beginning, to varying degrees, but like, the buildup at this time, like leading up, from the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1914, the French and the Germans were like ready to slog this out. It very much was like a fight was building up, and it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when.
Yeah, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. If you look at Europe at that time, you had, on one side, you had the British, the French, the Russians, and then you had on the other side the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and that was kind of like the five major powers. And then you had Italy and Turkey, who were kind of like these not major
Ottoman still.
powers. The Ottoman Empire. Excuse me. Thank you. Added World War One would lead to the creation of modern Turkey. However, the Ottoman Empire, they weren't considered a major power at this point. They were still kind of a minor power with Italy. And so the Central Powers, or really Germany and Austro-Hungary, Hungary used those two minor powers to try and tip the scales in their favor. So you're talking about this kind of buildup of this inevitable conflict. It's all about a power dynamic, like who's got more, okay? Because we've got to deter it. It's this horrible, like mutually assured destruction. It's like, okay, well, we
Yeah.
have to have more power than the allies, and the central powers have all of this, so we need to bring in more. So it's kind of this ever escalating series of alliances that gets you committed to a major conflict because you're trying to bring in more people to your side. And that's kind of a weird thing for us to conceptualize now, but at the time, that's how it was. Like the British and the French, we know now have had a traditional rivalry, but
Mm-hmm.
they knew that together they needed to stop Germany, this upstart, because for the past, at this point, like 300 years, Germany hadn't been united. So all of a
Yeah.
sudden, you have this massive power that's even bigger than France, with
Oh
the
yeah.
higher industrial capacity than France and England at
And
this
Great
point
Britain.
now.
Yep.
Yep. So now, okay, what do we do about the upstart? Well, it takes both of us. Now, how do we counter the Austro-Hungarians? Well, we've got Russia, but Russia's kind of backwards, and they've got all these allies, the South Slavs and Serbia and the Balkans. What do we do about them? So it's this massive mess, and it's all of these power games that they're playing. It's this convoluted game of chess. So yeah,
Right.
it's Edwardian summer came to an end.
That's right. Oh, that's a great way to put it. Yeah. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard of, the trench warfare, just the unmitigated slaughter on both sides. France had over 1 million casualties. Just really bad war for everybody involved. And a lot of disillusionment. But generally speaking, France rightfully saw itself as the victor. And, interestingly enough, here in the United States, we like to make T-shirts that say "Back-to-back World War II champs" or "World War champs." France, nobody in France was saying like the Americans won World War II for us in a way that they were saying the Americans won World War I for us. No one was saying that in the way that later on in World War II, everyone was saying the Americans won World War II for us
We
because if
showed
we
up
didn't
late to
go
the
in,
party.
yeah, we showed up super late to the party in World War One.
Yeah, like
And
to put in perspective, like how bad some of these like in one day, the Battle of the Frontiers, the French lost 20,000. They had 20,000 soldiers killed,
yeah,
not casualties,
not
killed
casualties. Yeah,
in one day. That is more. That is half of the U.S. casualties in the Vietnam War in one day in
yeah,
1914. So you can understand their not wanting to congratulate the Americans on showing up 11 months before the end of the war.
right. As opposed to World War II, which we were engaged for 4 years of World War II. We very much came in the 11th hour, and the American Expeditionary Force was actually relatively small. And we subordinated ourselves to Foch, the French field marshal. Anyway, some of the lessons that the French took away from World War One was one, the superiority of the French people, i.e., kind of similar to our Antebellum South episode, Southerners arrogantly thinking like one Southerner can whip 100 Yankees. Like, it didn't quite work that way.
Maybe
And
two, but it's like
two
a
at
2 to 1
max, right?
odds thing.
2 to 1. Sure, I'll take that. And so the superiority of the French people, the superiority of the defense, right? And the value of broad static fronts. So kind of think operationally here. The French view of like a front line from Switzerland to Belgium, they saw that as a good thing. And they saw that as like, hey, we can contain, we can be on the defensive, we can, win a war of attrition. They saw trench warfare as a good thing, believe it or not. And they saw massive artillery, like firepower, as a good thing, like heavy artillery. That's what we need to do. This was opposed to some lessons that the Germans and the Brits took. For example, Germans and the Brits took a lot more value on tanks, on aviation, and the role that airplanes would play. And maybe more broadly and conceptually, the Germans especially took away mobility and maneuver as how how you win in this new age of modern warfare. There's fascinating literature on this, like how the Germans developed their doctrine from 1918 to 1939.
We will
And
definitely get into that once we get closer to World War II.
yeah, another episode. But you can kind of see here the France took all the wrong lessons from World War One, and it all boils down to the fact that they saw themselves as the victor, and they're like, "Well, what we did was the right thing to do," and they didn't learn the right lessons. So, this view of the defensive, you get the Maginot Line, and for those of y'all that haven't heard of the Maginot Line, France regained Alsace-Lorraine. The Germans took it in 1870. They got it back, and they built this massive network of fortifications along the shared border between France and Germany. And it was basically
state of the art. It was
state of the art, basically impenetrable. They finished it well before, I think they finished it, in the late 20s, like even before the Depression. It wasn't like, just done right before World War II. And the way the Siegfried line was on the German side, the way it was still being constructed even in like 1938, I think. Anyway, and they very much put all their hopes on the defense. Now, interestingly enough, and this is going to come up in our next episode, but I'll briefly introduce it here. There was this demilitarization of the Rhineland. So of the Rhineland and an area known as the Saar, SAAR, in East Germany or Westphalia. The heart of Germany's industrial capacity was in this area, the Rhineland. And the reason why France in the Treaty of Versailles said that it would be demilitarized, and by demilitarized, the Germans were not allowed to station troops, and they were not allowed to build fortifications in this fairly large chunk of territory. The idea being that if France needed to rapidly execute an offensive invasion into Germany for whatever reason, they could take over the heart of the industrial and economic capacity of the country very quickly, and the Germans wouldn't be able to do anything about that. They basically held Germany's economy as a hostage. That was why they demilitarized the Rhineland. It wasn't because they just didn't want the Germans to invade them again. That's what the Maginot Line was there for. Rather, it was to allow the French military to go on the offensive. But as we see this stagnation in their military thought, where they primarily relied upon the defensive, in what we'll talk more about next week, they never exploited that opportunity until it was too late.
Another thought about the French, and it's not just, I think, that they saw the defensive as the key to victory. That is part of what they did. But another part is, of 39 million people in 1914 that lived in France, 1.3 million of them died. We don't know how many were injured. I mean, we do, but millions more were injured, displaced. And of that population, you think about how many of them were like young men who were newly married, never got married, or, they left a widow. There's like an entire generation right there of 1.3 million, mostly men doing the fighting at that point, mostly men wiped out. That's a large portion of your future generation, the generation that comes around to World War II. In their mind, I have to think that there was some serious damage to their psyche, as far as we never want to lose that many people again. So if being defensive is what we have to do in order to prevent a war like that again, let's do it. So they didn't really want to build an offensive war because they didn't want to either receive those casualties or inflict those casualties. And you think like they lost so many of, right. Think if you're 18 to 34, that's your age gap that most of those casualties were suffered in. So those were the ones who were making decisions come World War II. I mean, Gamelin was still like in charge of the French defense when the Germans invaded. So, I mean, he was still fighting World War I tactics. He was a hero in World War I. I just think that for Americans, I think we need to, when we look at World War II and how disastrous it was for France, I do want us to keep in mind that the French, it's not like losing a couple thousand in the Middle East. I don't mean to minimize that for US listeners, but they lost 1.3, they lost almost 2% of their population
Yeah, it's
in
hard to
4 years.
fathom.
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And, we'll see in later episodes, like the French Prime Minister Daladier, who would go negotiate at Munich, at the Munich conference in basically the partition of Czechoslovakia. Daladier fought in World War One, like he had been in the trenches. And, there was a lot of belief that he was trying to avoid the next war at all costs because of just the sheer horror that he and the rest of, his countrymen had experienced. Number one definitely took a disproportionate toll on France than anybody else. I mean, the trenches were in France and Belgium. They weren't in Germany. Now, the German economy took a disproportionate hit because,
Of the
the French,
indemnity.
or sorry, well, the indemnity, but even during the war, the British blockade, you know, that did a number on the British, or sorry, the German economy. But nevertheless, like you had large swaths of France that were just completely devastated, pockmarked, from all the artillery trenches. You can still see a lot of the trenches today, in Belgium included. Anyway, so you're right. Like it's one thing to emotionally kind of understand, like you can be sympathetic, but at the same time, like I think Schur makes the point, it requires a certain level of intellectual agility that the French army didn't have. They were too set in their ways. As a matter of fact, Schur had interviewed a couple people who, I think they were Brits, that went to the French war colleges. And they were quoted as saying the French war colleges, there were two main ones, had become a school of eunuchs, where it was no longer a question of raising the level of thinking. And then a different student said that the teaching was of astonishing poverty. And the idea is just that it's like, fast forward, it's 1930 something. They're still teaching 1918 tactics with zero intention of modernizing whatsoever. And that definitely became a reason why France would be in big trouble in 1940, for sure. Oh, sorry, one more quote, and this will be something that's referencing more and more as we keep going. So after the war, the French government established a parliamentary investigating committee. And the reports out of this investigating committee are fascinating, super interesting. Here's what this investigating committee said about the military. Our strategists were little more than bookworms in the library, sheltering their insufficiencies behind precedents. They had made the Ministry of War, the War Council, the General Staff, gigantic machines where the plethoric central services reigned amid mountains of paper. The General Staff, convinced of its infallibility, made the defense of its prejudices and prerogatives the essence of its actions. Having retired to its own Sinai among its revealed truths and the vestiges of its vanished glory, it lived on the margin of events, devoting all its efforts to patch up an organization which had been superseded by the facts.
Break. I don't know if you want me to put this in the episode. That sounds very, very familiar. A mountain
Also,
of
a mountain of paper.
a mountain of paper. Well, excuse me, a mountain of type. I mean, it's a running joke right now. I mean, the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
You know what? I'd say that sounds shockingly like the US military, and a lot of reports that have come out of the US military now that it is becoming more and more a machine that is more interested in paperwork and process,
Yeah.
vice action, ingenuity, winning. We are now more in favor of politics in the military. And look, the US military is far superior to everybody else. However, I think the gap is shrinking partly because of, as you said, a mountain of paperwork and,
Mm-hmm.
a an army of bookworms. That's such a, you can't have people who hide behind their own incompetence and their own infallibility, hide behind books and process and bureaucracy. If you do that, eventually the machine is going to break. No matter how big and powerful the machine is, eventually it's going to cave in on itself, or it's
Yeah.
going to be exploited by someone else. And as Americans, we don't need to sit here and think, well, we have better nukes, we have better planes, we have better this, and this, because that gap is diminishing. If you were to look at the zenith of American military power in like Desert Storm 91 compared to number 2, that gap seems to be shrinking a little bit.
Mm.
And even though you're still number 1, it's kind of like running a race
It's
and seeing
relative.
somebody behind you. Just because they're catching you, you shouldn't be like, well, I'm still leading. You should be
Yeah.
like, I need to run faster. I
Yeah,
need to
that's a
move
great
faster.
point.
I need to increase the gap. I'm not saying like, oh, we're getting past or we're going to lose. It's like, no, this is just a wake up call. Like, hey, France for a long time was considered the premier power.
Yeah.
France for a long time was considered really the ones who helped win the war in World War One. And they
Right.
thought like this afterward. It
Yeah.
should be a wake up call to the US
Totally.
military, to NATO, to many others.
Mm.
Wake up. Wake
Yeah.
up. Somebody's coming to catch you.
Yeah. And, furthermore, France was the dominant military power for roughly 1,000 years in continental Europe, right? Like roughly 1,000 years. And it was gone in 50. And I mean like gone in epic fashion. And interestingly enough, in the middle of that 50-year period, they won a major war. So it's like you might be actually, that's a great way to capture kind of the main idea here. It's that like you might be reeling from your success and you're in the middle of the worst defeat your country will ever face. Like 1,000 years of consistent success on the mainland, and it only takes 50 years for that to go away. And you even won some in the middle of that 50-year period. But you are in the middle of a crushing defeat, a
Another
slow,
thing that I
painful
think
death.
many people now, it's hard to conceptualize 1,000 years of dominance, really, in continental Europe. No, there were some losses, but 1,000 years of dominance. Like for Americans, I mean, we've been a country for 2.25, 2.5 almost at this point, 2.5, like 1,000 year. And for most of, for half of that, we were really very insignificant role in worldwide politics. So to tell somebody that a power for 1,000 years lost everything in less than 50,
Yeah.
that should also be kind of a wake up call and be like, hey, it may not last forever. It can go really quick. Wake
Yeah.
up.
Very, very quick. Another before we move on, because I do want to cover the economics briefly before we wrap up. But I love the eloquence of this quote
It's a
from the
lost art.
parliamentary invention. It's like, man, I love how it ended. It lived on the margin of events, devoting all its efforts to patch up an organization which had been superseded by the facts. Like, man, what an insult. Like, can you imagine any just red-blooded American, like somebody saying like 20 years after the fact, it's like your organization was superseded by the facts. Like you
Yeah, we're
frickin'
living through it.
suck.
We live through it. It's
Yeah,
interesting because we live through it on, instead of a 20-year cycle, we live through it on like a 20-day news cycle.
yeah, I think so. On your comment on it sounds a lot like the U.S. military. I have mixed feelings because I think in some sense it does, but I think in some sense it doesn't. And it's actually, this is a great point. This, what we've been talking about, we've been applying to the French military in general, right? But there were people who were the John the Baptist, the voices crying out in the wilderness. Charles de Gaulle was the big one. Charles de Gaulle publicly advocated as a colonel for things like tanks and the integration of aviation and close air support with tanks. And he advocated for creating armored mechanized divisions. The Germans had 3 pretty quickly, and he was like, well, how come we don't have any? So it's like there were people who were advocating for reforms. I partially have mixed feelings because, frankly, when I think about the U.S. military, I don't see, in this quote, our strategists were little more than bookworms. Are there those people in the U.S. military? Yes, there are. Would I venture to say that they're even a rough majority? No, I don't think so. I think, when you look at, the officer corps, going to be biased here, but, you get guys like James Mattis, Joe Dunford. I think even the current chairman, CQ Brown, is a very intelligent and very capable military officer who has great ideas. Now, there's definitely been exceptions to that rule. Like, Vietnam is a case in point. How we fought Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of the generals. What is it? Thomas Franks. Is that his name?
Tommy
Franks.
Franks.
No, not Tommy Franks. Gosh. Oh, this is terrible. Oh, here it is. Thomas Ricks. Forgive me, Thomas Ricks. Thomas Ricks wrote a great book called The Generals, where he basically poo-poos on all the army generals in Iraq and Afghanistan, like Tommy Franks and some others. And he's right. Like, these guys were just not good, to put it lightly. So it's like, I feel like the U.S. military is somewhat of a mixed bag.
Ask General Ripper after Millennium Challenge what he thinks about the U.S. military.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, for those of you interested,
please Google it.
You can Google it. Malcolm Gladwell actually talks about it in a chapter of his, and I think in his book Blink, he describes what Ripper did in Millennium Challenge. And Gladwell's a phenomenal storyteller. You just can't take him too seriously because it's like pseudoscience. Sorry, Malcolm Gladwell, if you're listening to this podcast.
He is.
Anyway, so it's like, I think there's some aspects for the U.S. military aren't, but I think, we don't have like any Wagons. I don't know how to say that guy's names, or Gamlons. I think by and large, the officer corps in the U.S. military is excellent. However, we have definitely punted it in the stands a few times. Okay, real quick. Break. Go ahead, Colin. What?
Hold on. There is an amazing thing that one of my coworkers sent me. Damn it. Hold on. It talks about two different types of organizations. So break. So this is interesting. Like, I don't want to belabor the U.S. military too long. However, I think France is kind of similar with it. If you've ever worked in corporate America as like just you understand that, like, unless you're a CEO or you're on the board of directors, like, you have literally no power, and any suggestion you make, anything you step outside of your like preconceived box, you're just going to get squashed. Like, and it's not going to be like a bunch of people angry at you. It's just going to be squashed under the bureaucracy of the system that you exist in. And I think that's what a lot of the French military at the time and the U.S. military is facing now. The sheer bureaucracy that exists with an organization that size. So at Amazon, it's interesting. Amazon came up with this, and I think this was like in a letter to shareholders back in like 2015. So there's like two things with decisions, and I think every organization should think this way. And the French didn't, obviously. So there's a one-way door, type 1. Decisions that are consequential and nearly irreversible should be made methodically, carefully, slowly, with great deliberation and consultation. There's two-way doors. Decisions that are changeable and reversible should be made quickly by high judgment individuals or small groups. If you made a suboptimal decision, you can reopen the door and go back through. And so then Jeff Bezos went on to say this: as organizations get bigger, there seems to be a tendency to use type 1 decision-making on most decisions, including many type 2 type decisions. The end result is slowness, unthoughtful risk aversion, failure to experiment sufficiently, and consequently dismal innovation. We'll have to figure out how to fight the tendency. I think both the French and the U.S. military now is uniformly moving to type 1 type of decisions all over across the board.
Yeah,
That's the problem.
I definitely agree. Risk aversion is a cancer in the U.S. military for sure.
And it's not just risk aversion, like we're doing a risky training mission. It's like, no, like I don't want to risk even coming up or saying something that would be outside of the preordained box that I've been given, because that could be suicide for your career.
I would even go one step further and say that Congress doesn't help this out at all because Congress incentivizes the US military to play it safe quite a bit. I mean, just look at research and development because that's all Congress directs those dollars. Like the DoD kind of asks, but it's Congress going, you will spend this much money on these certain things. But time and time again, we get congressmen that are requiring the U.S. military. The Air Force is a great case in point, where it's like, no, you will continue to fund the A-10 and J-STARS, even though both of those platforms were designed fighting the Russians in the Fulda Gap in Eastern Europe. And literally no one thinks that we're going to do that right now. But no, I think we should keep those things because it keeps my constituents happy, etc. So it's like, yes, risk aversion for sure. And Congress somewhat incentivizes that also.
Anyway, economics.
Okay, yeah. We just briefly, we would be remiss if we did a Fall of France series and didn't talk about the Great Depression.
This will be kind of one of those bridge topics, I feel like.
Yeah.
I think we're going to bridge this into next episode.
Yeah, because I really want to talk about the remilitarization of the Rhineland in the next one. But so interesting and just real quick, the Great Depression came late to France. So France was actually on an economic rebound when the Great Depression hit the US and later the rest of Europe. So it actually took a second for unemployment to really spike, which unemployment and the closure of businesses are, almost two sides of the same coin that really define the Great Depression. And so it didn't really like come into full swing like by 1931, 32, things were pretty bad in the United States. Things didn't get bad in France until like 34, 35. So that by 1936, the number one thing that France put off doing that America and Great Britain had already done was to devalue their currency. And similar to what we saw in COVID, the idea behind devaluing your currency in times of economic depression is it can stimulate spending. When there's more money in circulation, it tends to give energy to spending, and that can, somewhat kickstart your economy. There's a whole bunch of other considerations there that just for the sake of time, we're not going to go into. Well, the French did not devalue the franc until late 1936. And basically that decision, France would still be kind of getting over the Great Depression by 1940. Whereas, especially in the United States and Great Britain, like everyone kind of talks about how like World War II got us out of the Great Depression. The reality is like unemployment was still elevated, but not like it was in the early 30s when there were all the runs on the banks. Really by like 1930, the same time, 1936. Like it was kind of things were on the up and up by 36.
Jay and I talk about it in a previous episode. You'll have to go back and listen.
Yeah, which episode was that?
It was one of the economic ones we talked about. Actually, we kind of touched on it in two because we talked about the history of politics in the U.S. and economics.
Oh, yeah. That's
Kinda-
great. Go back and listen to our old stuff. No, you're right. Anyway, so they waited. The role that this played is like they didn't necessarily, booger up a response to the Great Depression. It was kind of a series of unfortunate events. And then the big one, they just kind of waited too long to fix. So France didn't have a lot of remilitarization. Their economy was still kind of struggling, lagging behind the other Western powers by the time 1940 turned around. And that, of course, like played a role in its collapse. Okay, so today we covered the Dreyfus Affair. We talked a little bit more about the political divide that grew in that country and some unfortunate repercussions from that. We spent a lot of time talking about the military, some of the lessons, the bad lessons learned that the French military learned from World War I. We read some awesome quotes, and we covered very briefly the Great Depression. financial decisions. And so next week, really excited to talk about the remilitarization of the Rhineland and how France punted in the stands. Honestly, its last chance to avert war. After that, there really wasn't a possibility of avoiding war, but there were possibilities that in war they could have won. But maybe in if their decisions would have been different in remilitarizing the Rhineland, all of World War II could have been avoided. And we will tell the story of how they jacked that up. Colin,
Yeah.
back to you.
Jay, that was great. Great conversation. It was very, I like those episodes where we just kind of get going on a topic. We took a few tangents this episode, but it was great. So, in closing, for our listeners out there, if you like or leave a comment on Apple, Spotify, or Podcast Addict, we know who you are. We can give you a shout out. For YouTube subscribers, if you subscribe and like and leave a comment, as long as it's something that we think we can take and share in the episode, we'll give you a shout out as well. If you follow us on social media, Jay and I are both on Twitter and Instagram and some variation of Loins of History. We also have Gmail. If you want to reach out to us, we've had a few listeners reach out in the past before. So we do love hearing from you and getting feedback from our listeners, just to spread the word and help the algorithm boost the messaging, what we're trying to do here at the Loins of History. So we do appreciate you as listeners, and we look forward to talking about the fall of the French Republic, Third Republic, next week.